What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Long Game Podcast hosted by Thomas Kopelman and Jacob Turner. In each episode, you'll hear us break down financial topics that are relevant to you and your situation. Our goal is to help bring credible financial information to you in short, bite-sized episodes.
All opinions expressed on this show are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on the Long Game Podcast should be considered advice. Always consult with your team of professionals before making any decisions regarding your finances. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. Really excited for the discussion today. We're going to be talking all about real estate investing with Aleksey Chernobelskiy. Super excited about the conversation. One, because I'm personally interested in real estate investing, and two, I think it's one of the most common things that comes up. So, Aleksey, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me, guys. So great to be here.
Absolutely. So we got to know each other a little bit through Twitter, and frankly, I was kind of snooping some of your stuff before we had connected via DM because I was just reading about and trying to understand it. And you've put out some incredible articles on LP investing, but would love to just have you share 30 seconds around how you got into this business in the first place, why you're helping LP investors now, and what that looks like.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks again for having me on. I think in very short, I used to be in the institutional world. Specifically when it comes to publicly traded companies, things are ran a certain way, and I would say generally speaking, it's more efficient, and there are more controls in place. But you're also, generally speaking, not raising money from retail investors, right? And I think I got introduced to the syndication game over the past few years. And to be candid, I didn't realize how big it is until about 2 years ago, just in terms of the sheer size of raises in the US alone. And that got me really interested. And I realized that, generally speaking, people are exceptionally bright and talented in their own way. They had to amass a certain amount of capital to participate in these transactions. But when it comes to actually investing, some of them at least might need a second hand, an independent eye, and I hope to provide that.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic because I think it is talked about all the time on social media. Like, I think we went through a phase where everything was about owning your own rentals and owning real estate and the tax benefits. And then now I've even seen more of a shift of like, well, hey, I'm a business owner. I realize I don't really have the time. I want to get involved in, real estate syndications. And I think like people just think like that word means it's a good investment, right? Like if I buy real estate, that means real estate goes up. That means I'm going to get paid profits. Life is really good. And that is true in certain cases, right? But it's not the same thing as like buying two really well-known ETFs. Like, hey, maybe they're very similar. Life's pretty easy. Like the difference of who manages those funds, how they manage them. And then I think the other thing for people to think about is the liquidity. I think people a lot of times invest and fail to realize that this isn't like, I can't just get out of it tomorrow, like a normal ETF. Like this could be a lot of years down the line. And so like, it has to be part of your financial plan to understand how do you make sure that you're okay without those funds down the line.
Right. And I mean, that's great, Thomas. And I think perhaps maybe a simpler way to summarize that, from my opinion, and I'm very public about this, is I think passive investing starts in a very active manner, right? And if it does not start in an active manner, I think you're kind of just throwing money and hope. I mean, that's just kind of like going to a casino in a sense. And it could be that you did well just based on where the macroeconomics were at the time. But I wouldn't call that investing. It's slightly different.
Yeah, I like the Morgan Housel quote that's like, it's really hard to know with investing whether you're good or you're lucky. And
Yep.
I think a lot of people, even in this world too, right? Like I picked this great syndicate. This went really well. I'm great at it, right? And half the time these people they're like, hey, buddy told me to invest in this. I invested in it. It's not even like they analyzed it at all. But I think that,
Yes.
distinguishing between luck and skill is nearly impossible in the investing world.
Yes, and if I may add a little bit, a big fan of his work for what it's worth. But from my experience, I've also realized that like when people go to a casino, they know that they're gambling, right? So you hopefully don't over allocate yourself to the gambling strategy, right? But when it comes to LP investments, as you guys have both pointed out at this point, it's like there's this aura of like safety, and it's an asset, and everyone needs a place to live. And what could go wrong? I could just sell it at any point, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard. I see Jacob smiling. Like, I'm sure you guys have heard these things. And the reality, I think, is if you don't, if the initial investment is not active, as I said before, it's actually in a sense much worse than going to the casino, because at least at the casino you're sort of careful on how much you bring into the casino. You bring the $100 bill, and you can't spend any more or whatever, right? Here it feels safe, and you're sort of your guardrails are a little bit missing.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that LP investing typically has this stigma of like it's this safe way to have an asset that you can touch and feel and see, and it's safe?
Well, I think it's because in its most ethical form, it is safe, right? In other words, the assumption isn't false. It's just it just it doesn't always become a reality based on who you're dealing with, right? In other words, the thought that you can buy a piece of real estate. I mean, you can think about like a single family rental, right, and sort of extrapolate from there. So you buy a property, you buy it well, you put 30-year debt on it. Like, you could not do phenomenally well in terms of your equity if like there's a down market, but overall, like over a long enough period of time, you'll be fine. Then you go to syndications and commercial. First of all, LTVs sometimes go up, sometimes they're lower. Second of all, there's more risk typically because it's sort of like a value add type play in order to get 1.5 to 2x times returns. And third of all, there's typically like a ticking, I don't want to call it a ticking time bomb, like an expiration, right, on either the fund or the property LLC. Like you basically promise, like, hey, in 5 years, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And so, and more than that, not only is there sort of an expectation from investors, more importantly, there is a capital partner of yours that has a 5-year debt or a 3-year note that's maturing. And that, to be candid, that's like probably 80% of the distress that's going on now is stuff that was bought in like 2021, 2022. And the prefs are coming due, the loans are coming due, rate caps are expiring, and those are, the asset might be worth a little bit less than before, but that's not even the issue.
I think it's interesting the way that you're framing this now, because I think a lot of people, when they think of, syndicates, I think they're just assuming they're just buying into a fund that owns hundreds of rentals, right? Like, not that it's like we got to make quick funds, got to get rid of them. And so I think for the average person, when they think of it and they think of it that way, they feel less risk, right? Because in general, right, real estate does go up over a long period of time. Sure, there are periods that it goes down, but if you can hold on for a long enough period of time, like people need homes, people need properties, that feels less risky than owning one property, even though your framing right now is actually, it is more risky because of what they're trying to do with those properties and the returns that they're trying to generate. But, not every property does go up either. Like, I have 2 client situations right now where like they bought in downtown Austin in this really beautiful condo, and their place, they want to upgrade because now they make 3x what they used to make. And their property is $300,000 under value. Like, they can't even pay off the debt to run it. So they're like, do I have a negative cash flow rental, or do I pay off a few $100,000 that we can't really have? And like, I have another client, they own a condo in New York or in California, and the foundation is basically breaking. And so the HOA is like trying to fix things. They can't sell this property. So like, even though people think it never happens, like in one property, there are plenty of times where you aren't going to come out ahead. But
Yes.
I think this is really interesting, the way of the syndicates. I don't think most people do understand of what the goal is. And so I think maybe digging a little deeper into like how the syndicates work and what they're trying to do, I think is important.
Yeah. So let me touch on that quickly. Putting it very simply, a syndication is a partnership between a general partner who generally finds the investment, operates it, and essentially executes on whatever business plan that exists. And the LP generally provides the majority of the capital for that. And typically there's what's called a waterfall and a promote to sort of like try to align incentives. There's a co-invest, there are fees involved. Maybe it's a conversation for now or not. We'll see if we get to it. But that's the general setup, right? And as you noted earlier, some syndications are asset level. In other words, like Thomas, you are an LP in a single property LLC, and that is, either this thing crushes it and you do really well, or it does mediocre, or it does really poorly, then you lose all your money, right? There are also syndications into funds, which invest across, in some cases, a variety of asset classes, in some cases, just a collection of, let's say, multifamily buildings or industrial buildings. And both of those also carry pros and cons. Meaning, in some sense, a fund is better because there's diversification. In another sense, typically those are pretty blind pools. Like you're essentially giving your money, and you generally know the criteria of what the GP is buying, but you don't get to see it deal by deal like you would in a just a property level LLC syndication.
You have this incredible article on top 15 syndication mistakes. And I know I've personally learned a lot through reading it, and I've read it multiple times. I'm curious for you, having looked at a bunch of different real estate deals personally, having looked at a bunch of different real estate deals for clients, if you could take out 2 or 3 nuggets that you think are really important for people as they're looking at potentially becoming an LP in any sort of real estate syndication, what would be the most important things for them to look at?
Really quick, before we dive into it, I just want to ask one more question, sticking with where we were, can you also explain to people how, like, obviously we understand the investing, but like, how does it work after I put money in? Just so people can know, like,
oh, sure,
how do I get paid out?
Sure.
How do I exit? Am I able to?
I mean, essentially, in short, the way it's set up is you give your money, and at that point, you essentially have no control over what happens, right? And, which is why, actually, this kind of, Jacob, kind of rolls straight back to your question, which is I've put together what I call the 3 pillars of LP investing. And many times people will say, how do I look at an LP investment? Well, location, location, location. And for what it's worth, I disagree. In other words, yes, location is important, but the property that you're buying, in my opinion, sort of comes third when you're looking at LP investments, which is not the same thing as a GP looking at deals. That's its own criteria set. But from an LP perspective, Thomas, because the investment is completely silent and very much based on trust after day one, there's a big component of this, which I call execution, which is a mixture of a few things, but track record, your ability to trust this person, have they done this before, et cetera, et cetera. And then the second one is alignment of interest, which is how are you guys aligned in both good outcomes and bad outcomes, because you want to make sure that the incentives don't fall away if things aren't working out. And only third is the property. That's not to say the property isn't important, but I think in many decks, if you properly go through step 1 and 2, you actually don't really get to 3. And that, that might surprise some people. Yeah. And happy to take any questions. Obviously, I think, Jacob, in terms of picking out a few, one of the hardest things about LP investing, I think, and I'm very vocal about this, is it's a very active investment in the beginning. And so, for example, I'll just give you a practical example. Let's say I said, and I do see this on Twitter all the time. Let's say I said, if you see an investment that has a 6% acquisition fee, pass, right? And let's even go a little bit further.
Could you stop and explain what an acquisition fee is?
So an acquisition fee generally is an LP puts in money, and a portion of that money goes to the GP before doing any work on the closing itself to essentially compensate them for finding the deal, which, to be fair, it takes a long time to find deals. Many times deals don't work out. There's earnest money that's lost sometimes. So there's a reason that they're there. But there are sort of acquisition fees that are below market, within market, and then there's stuff that's like way above. Generally speaking, I would say 6%, according to most, would be called way above in like the retail syndication space. But and let me give you another example. If you go to you pull up a deck and you're on the first page and it says, we're proud to offer you a 50-50 split with no pref. So like I guarantee you like 75% of people who think they're like involved in LP investing will be like, whoa, this is terrible, like pass, right? Like I'm used to my 7%, 8% pref, and then maybe it's 70-30 split or 80-20 split where like the larger numbers go to the LP. But then they forgot to go to the next page where it says that the GP is contributing 50% of the project themselves. And that really matters. Meaning that doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden you stop everything and wire the check. You still have to like go through a lot of other stuff. But comparing a 5% co-invest to a 50% co-invest is a very big that's a very big difference. And some people may prefer a 50% investment that's material to the GP with less economics because they feel a lot more protected on the downside. Like this GP has a lot of money riding in this thing, you know? So it just, I'm always very hesitant to give, one or two, so to speak. And there's also a reason why in this article, I never called them red flags for this specific reason. You know, the fact that someone has a 6% acquisition fee or a 50-50 split above no pref is not a red flag. It's a reason to pause and think, which is what I call it. In other words, you should recognize that this isn't normal, and you should then search for something that offsets that. And if you don't find it, so then perhaps you pass. But don't just pass by the fact that you see something that's not normal. You know.
I love how you talk about the fact that you need to be very active in this investment that's inherently passive, right? As an LP, it's about as passive as you can be once you put the money up, right? You have no decision-making power. You don't have any voting rights. You effectively don't have control, right? But at the end of the day, you have to be very active on the upfront to make sure that you're doing kind of that second level due diligence, like what you talked about, where you can read the first page and understand what somebody's saying. But it's not that you should say no. It's that you should take one step further and say, why is it this case? And if it makes sense, great, maybe we move forward.
Exactly.
I think the other point, I was just saying, I think the other point that you made that's really interesting is like the amount of capital the general partner is putting in, right? I think it's the same thing. Like you see all the time, people talk about it on social media, like make sure the financial advisor you work with is investing the same way you do. I think it is important, right? Because I think that shows the belief. I think if you're just taking capital and you're investing, but you're not willing to put your own money behind it, it either shows, it mostly shows to me a lack of belief in what you're doing. Because if it's this great investment that you think everybody else should be in, why are you only putting 5% in unless, it's $100 million fund and, 5% is actually quite a bit. But I think that's a really important thing that I don't think the average person would even think about looking for.
Right. I would also say though, even that is like so intricate because, for example, what if I told you that, I don't know, a 25-year-old comes to you and says, hey, I found this opportunity. Here's the deck. And let's say the deck is well written and like, he had like 3 years of experience, let's say. So like he put out a decent model. He found something off market and he says like, I don't have any money to my name. Like I found this deal and let's say you look at it and it looks legit and then he tells you, listen, like I fully recognize the fact that this is my first deal ever. You're taking a massive risk. Like I don't really know what I'm doing and I'm transparent about that. And because of that, I'll give you a 95% over a 7, let's say, or 90% over a 7. So again, it's very easy to say like if someone doesn't have experience, pass. But I don't think that's how the investment world works. Like I mean, back in the day at Store, I ran a 20-person team looking at, I don't know, in some cases, dozens of deals every single week. And the most difficult part of that is always, what do you pass on? What do you restructure? Meaning, how do you incentivize alignments in a way that makes the transaction make sense, and what do you buy as is, right? And so I think the LPs, without having as much volume, obviously, but they need to be thinking in that way. In some ways, it could be better to invest in someone that has very little experience, that someone has a medium level of experience, just because of the risk reward and the risk that you want to take on personally, which is a whole other topic that many people don't think about.
So in short, it depends.
Yeah,
The
The
old
best
thing
the
is
best
finance
worst
everything.
answer out there.
yeah, and but like that. Here's the thing, though, guys. Like if that answer doesn't work for you, it might not be a good idea to allocate a lot of money to LP investing or any like.
Hmm.
And
Well, let's stick with that.
Yeah, like
Let's stick with
I'm
that.
very independent, for a reason, because I can say this and I'll stand behind my opinion. In other words, if if you don't have the time, sometimes I'll get calls and be like, "Hey, I have 10 million to place. Like, can you tell me where to put it? Like, I'll even pay you." And I say, "I'm sorry, I can't help you." Like, I if you don't have time to figure out how to think about these things and whether you're okay with the level of risks that you're taking or not, I just don't think you should be investing in this. Like, go take an ETF. There's public REITs out there. There's a ton of different things available to you, and um, yeah, I think you should know, to a certain degree at least, what you're invested in, what the downside of it is, and that takes time.
Well, let's stick with that topic. Like, who are the right people to be investing or considering to be investing in real estate syndications?
Um, I mean, you're not going to like the answer, but I think it depends, right? And let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. I have this conversation a lot. Let's say someone has done 5 deals and they've all done well, right? And another sponsor has done 100 deals, 99 of them went well, and the latest one, the number 100, just went into foreclosure. So which one is better? Right? So like half of Twitter will just blow up and be like, "Oh, the foreclosure guy is terrible. Don't invest him. Like blast him." But like that's not how this works. Like investments are complicated, and sometimes you lose money, right? And so um, the way that I view my job is I want to make sure that the LP realizes when they're investing in someone, if the GP is not transparent about the fact that his deal or her deal is in foreclosure, I want to make sure that they simply know that fact. I don't follow up with that statement by saying, "Hey, you know, they're in foreclosure, so you shouldn't invest," right? I just tell them like this is important for you to know, and I don't see it on a deck. That in and of itself is interesting information, perhaps, because this is a trust-based relationship, right? Like if you have something in distress and you're not kind of openly talking about that, again, up to the LP how they interpret that and their relationship. But my I feel like my responsibility is to give them the information, and as much information as they could possibly need to make the right decision.
Yeah, I think for me, the way that I think about it is like the people who are right for this one are, yes, you have to be willing to take the time, understand it, research it, make sure it's the right thing. But you also have to have a good financial plan in place to say, like, hey, we're not taking too much concentration or too much risk here. We also need to have liquidity elsewhere because if there's goals that are coming up in the next 2, 5, potentially even 10 years, this is not going to be the thing that's going to fund that or sponsor that. I think it's probably people who are not already over allocated to real estate. Like if you already own a bunch of rent, it's hard because like if you already own a bunch of rentals, is that something that you want to do? For me, I would almost say no, because that's a really large exposure real estate. But at the same time, you might have a lot of losses over here that are passive for you that could help offset some gains over here that are also passive.
Yes.
So like, you know, that's
Yeah,
another thing,
and that's
right?
sort of like that's like a portfolio management question. In other words, like how should you allocate your cash? And you know, you should talk to Jacob about that, right? But I think from also just from the GP's perspective, um, I think it's really important for LPs to understand that at its very simple level, a GP is an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult business to run because it's generally cash flow negative until a promote kicks in. That's just how it works, right? And so I think both LPs and GPs need to understand what they're signing up for. Obviously, you're talking to someone who must be risk taking enough to take on such a venture, right? But you also need to not forget your own self interest and protect yourself.
Totally. Totally. I know you have to run. So, any last closing thoughts that you have on this topic for our listeners?
Uh, no, I write weekly on this. If anyone listening, wants to read it, it's lplessons.substack.com. And my name is pretty unique, so I think people can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn if they want to see some more content.
Totally. Totally. Well, we really appreciate you
Thank you,
coming
guys.
on. I know we are scrambling to make this work, but thank you for finding the time to hop on and share this info. It's a topic that we haven't talked about, but obviously, as we can all attest to, we see this on social media all the time. And it's something that we want to make sure people get right because it is a really good opportunity when done well. So thanks for coming on. And everybody, thank you for listening. Please rate and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you back next week.